In the quiet heart of an American forest, a grieving veteran cuts into an old cedar tree and finds something inside that was never meant to be found. From that moment, his life becomes a reckoning with truth, guilt, and redemption. Stay with the story, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The cabin sat like a memory in the middle of Cedar Hollow wood, darkened by years of rain smoke drifting from its crooked chimney, and the hush of pine needles falling on the roof like soft ash. Elias Warren lived there 52, a man shaped by both silence and loss. Each morning he rose before the sun, boiled coffee that tasted of smoke and tin, and watched the forest turn from gray to gold. Sometimes out of habit he poured 2 cups. On the wall hung a photograph of a woman with soft eyes, Martha, and beside it a boy no older than 20 in uniform, smiling like he didn't know war yet. Elias talked to them sometimes quietly, as if the air between the frames still carried their breath. He hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, but the forest still answered the creak of trees. The breaking ice, a distant hawk's cry. The mail truck came once a month, a red blur on the white road. Most times it passed without stopping. But that morning the driver waved, shouted through the cold, "Got something for you, Mr. Warren." The regional depot cleared a batch of undelivered military mail. "This one's yours." Elias frowned. No one sent him mail anymore. He signed the slip, took the envelope. It was old, the corners, soft. The postmark faded a decade back, December 2012. The sender's name made his chest tighten. Daniel Warren, his son. The return address was an army base he hadn't spoken of in years. Inside was a letter, folded twice the paper, yellowed, but uncreased like it had waited patiently. The first words trembled in his hand. "Hey, Dad. I'll be home next month. Don't go anywhere till I get there." Elias sat down slowly, as though the earth had shifted. He read the lines again, each one heavier than the last. Daniel wrote about sandstorms and laughter about a friend named Lopez who made bad coffee, about how he missed the sound of pine cones hitting the roof back home. The last line was what broke him. "If I don't make it back, live for me. Don't let the silence win." He didn't cry at first. Instead, he stood by the window, letter pressed to the glass, watching the horizon swallow the day. His breath fogged the pain. The silence, the same one that had kept him safe all these years now, felt like a wound. Night came early. He lit the kerosene lamp, opened an old box where he kept Martha's letters, photographs, and the few medals the army had mailed him after Daniel's death. He placed the new letter on top. For a long time, he just stared at it, tracing the ink with his thumb. Then, as if speaking to someone still listening, he whispered, "I tried, son. I really tried." The wind picked up, pressing against the door like a heartbeat. The forest groaned. Outside, a branch snapped, echoing like a gunshot. Elias's hands trembled around the cup of cold coffee. He thought of stepping outside, but something stopped him, a soft, insistent feeling of being watched. He looked at the photograph again. Martha's eyes seemed to hold him steady. "One more day," he muttered. "I'll make it one more day." Later, lying on his cot, he listened to the creek murmuring beyond the walls. Somewhere in that rhythm, he thought he heard Daniel's voice, faint, almost teasing, "Don't let the silence win." He smiled bitterly into the dark. "You always were stubborn," he said aloud. Then, for the first time in years, he laughed. It was rough, unused, but real. The next morning, Elias folded the letter carefully, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and stepped outside. Frost crackled beneath his boots. The air smelled of pine and ash. Across the clearing, the sun caught on a stand of old cedars, their trunks wide, their bark twisted by time. One of them leaned oddly, as if listening. He thought he saw a flicker of light glint inside a hollow near its base, but when he blinked, it was gone. "Trick of the sun," he said to himself. Still, his eyes lingered. The forest had kept his secrets for decades. Now, for reasons he couldn't name, it felt like it wanted to share one of its own. He walked toward the tree, stopping just short of the shadow it cast. The hollow was dark, the air colder there. Something about it made his skin tighten, but the day was late, and he had wood to split. He turned away, unaware that in the silence behind him, something metallic shifted within the hollow like a whisper, waiting to be heard. The next morning broke pale and thin, the kind of winter light that made everything look older than it was. Elias pulled on his worn jacket, the letter from Daniel still tucked inside the pocket, and stepped into the cold. His breath rose like smoke, disappearing into the fog that clung to the valley floor. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the whisper of snow melting from the cedars. He walked toward the ridge behind the cabin axe, over his shoulder, eyes searching for fallen limbs to cut for firewood. The ground was uneven, the air sharp with the scent of sap. The forest had a way of feeling alive here, and some days Elias could swear it was watching him. He reached the clearing he'd seen the day before, where that peculiar cedar leaned toward the light, as though burdened by its own secrets. Up close, the trunk was immense, easily 3 men wide. The bark swelled along one side into a thick, bulbous knot, smooth in places where the wood curved outward unnaturally. Elias laid a hand against it and paused. The surface was warm. Not the faint warmth of morning sun, but a pulse of heat, steady and deep, as though something beneath the bark was breathing. He pulled his hand back, frowned, and touched it again. Still warm. The rest of the tree was cold to the touch, crusted with frost. A shiver passed through him that wasn't from the air. "Strange," he murmured. He pressed his ear against the trunk, half expecting only the hum of wind through the branches. Instead, a faint hollow clink metal against metal rose from within, as if a loose latch inside a tin box had tapped the wood. Elias straightened, heart beating faster than he cared to admit. He stepped back, studied the tree. The wind had stilled completely, and yet he could have sworn that the sound came again, clearer this time. The tone light but deliberate, as if some hidden part of the forest wanted to be found. He crouched near the base where the bark seemed thinner and drew the small knife he used for carving. The first cut released a damp, earthy smell mixed with something sharper. Iron wrought the ghost of decay. He scraped again, and the knife's tip struck something solid beneath the wood, producing a muted clang. He froze. His instincts whispered caution, but curiosity outweighed them. He returned to the cabin, fetched his handsaw, and came back before the day slipped into dusk. Each pull of the blade groaned through the cedar's skin flakes of resin clinging to his gloves. The scent grew stronger, no longer just wood and sap, but something sour, like water, trapped too long underground. His breath misted as he sawed deeper until dark sap seeped out thick, viscous. He stepped back, eyes narrowing. The sap, if it was sap, had a rusty tint, and its smell was unmistakably wrong. He reached into the narrow opening with a gloved hand and felt the hollow space within. His fingers brushed against cold metal. He pulled back, blinking at the slick residue left on the glove. Somewhere above, a gust of wind stirred the branches, and for an instant the entire tree shuddered, a low groan rising from its core. Elias dropped the saw. The echo of that noise hung in the air long after it faded, as though the forest itself had exhaled. He stood there, chest rising and falling, a man suddenly aware of the weight of his own heartbeat. The evening light caught on the wet edge of the wood, making it glisten faintly, as if the tree had bled. He wiped his gloves clean, staring at the hollow. Inside, something metallic gleamed faintly in the dim light, round, smooth, deliberate. He couldn't tell what it was. For a long time he didn't move. The wind began again, sweeping through the valley, carrying the faint chime of something shifting within the cedar, and Elias knew with a certainty that chilled him that he would have to open it further. The wind died sometime in the night, leaving the forest heavy and still. By dawn, a thin frost clung to the bark of the cedar, sealing over the wound Elias had carved. He returned with tools, his saw, a chisel, a small lantern, and set them down in the snow. His hands felt stiff, not from cold, but from the weight of what he meant to do. The hollow in the trunk gaped like an eye, dark and silent. Elias crouched, pressing his ear once more against the wood. Nothing now. Only silence, deep as sleep. He hesitated, then pushed the blade in again. The first strike echoed dully, and the next, until the weakened bark split apart under his effort. A burst of damp air escaped, thick with the smell of earth, long undisturbed. Inside lay a narrow cavity lined with rot and threads of blackened sap. His lantern light flickered against something metallic. He reached in carefully and pulled free a rusted box small enough to cradle in both hands. Its edges were corroded, the lock eaten away by time. When he tilted it, he heard a faint rattle from within. He set it down on a flat rock, took a screwdriver from his belt, and pried it open. The lid creaked like a groan from a throat too long unused. A puff of stale air rose sharp and sour. Inside were fragments of a life buttons, a tarnished pocket knife, a pair of spectacles bent out of shape, and beneath them a strip of cloth so brittle it turned to dust between his fingers. Then he saw it, a bone small, clean white, no longer than his palm. The sight rooted him in place. For a moment, all he could hear was his pulse. He traced the curve of the bone, swallowed hard, and reached deeper. There was something else wrapped in oilcloth. He unfolded it slowly, revealing a leather-bound notebook, its surface cracked, but the pages dry. Across the front, faint but legible, were 2 words: Caleb, 1978. The name meant nothing at first, but the year did. It was the same year Martha had met him when they'd first moved to Cedar Hollow. Elias turned the book over in his hands, uneasy. The leather felt warm from his touch, as if it recognized him. He carried the box and the notebook inside, setting them on the table beside the lamp. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar smoke and damp earth, now a mingling that unsettled him. He sat down, wiping his hands on a cloth, and opened the notebook. The handwriting was firm at the beginning, careful, then faltered across later pages. The first entries spoke of weatherwork schedules and notes about logging routes, but then the tone changed. The writer mentioned disputes, missing men, something hidden in the forest. One page described a voice in the trees, another warned, "They know. I have to hide the proof." Elias read, faster eyes scanning line after trembling line. The ink smeared near the end as though written in haste. The final entry stopped him cold. "If anyone finds this, tell Martha Warren I did not betray her husband." The words blurred as he read them again, disbelieving. His breath caught. Martha Warren. His Martha. He felt as though the ground had given way beneath him. He pushed the notebook aside, stood abruptly, and stared at the window. Outside, the cedars stood motionless, their shadows stretching long and dark across the snow. "No," he whispered the word, barely sound. The fire popped behind him, throwing sparks that danced against the walls. He picked up the notebook again, turning it over, half expecting the name to vanish. But there it was, etched into the cover by a hand long gone. A tremor passed through his chest, part fear, part recognition. He remembered a night years ago when Martha had woken him, saying she thought she'd seen someone in the trees, a figure watching the cabin before dawn. He'd laughed, then told her it was probably the wind. Now the memory felt like a blade turned inward. Elias sank into the chair, eyes closed. He tried to recall if he had ever heard the name Caleb before, but the years blurred together. His fingers found the edge of the letter from Daniel still tucked in his pocket. He unfolded it, laid it beside the notebook. 2 lives, 2 voices from the past, both speaking to him through the same silence. He stared at the page until the letters swam. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped sharp and close, breaking the stillness. Elias looked up, heart hammering, every nerve alert. Elias did not sleep that night. The lantern burned low until dawn, its light trembling against the window panes like a heartbeat. He sat hunched over the table, the notebook open in front of him, its words echoing in his head. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whispering through the trees as if repeating the same question he couldn't stop asking himself. Who was Caleb? And what had he meant to Martha? Elias turned another page, his fingers slow, almost reverent. The ink had faded, but the story it told came alive with each line. Caleb had been a foreman for Granger Timber, the same company that had once employed Elias when he first came to Cedar Hollow. The entries spoke of illegal cutting beyond the state line of trucks that moved at night, and of people who asked too many questions. Elias remembered those years well. The long shifts, the men who vanished without word. and the quiet orders from the top, never to talk about them. He had walked away from the company after Martha begged him to, saying she didn't trust the men he worked for. Now, reading Caleb's words, he realized she had known far more than she had ever told him. A tremor ran through his hands as he reached for his coffee mug, only to find it cold. He poured another, stared at the dark liquid, and saw her reflection instead of his own. Martha, he whispered the name, tasting like both prayer and apology. He opened a drawer, pulling out an old stack of newspapers he kept for lighting fires. Buried beneath them were older papers, yellowed and brittle. He spread them across the table, scanning the dates, 1978, 1979, until one headline stopped him cold: local foreman missing, after flooding near Cedar Hollow. The photo beneath the title was grainy, but the face was unmistakable. Caleb. His jaw was square, his expression calm, the kind of man who looked like he believed the world could still be fixed if someone just tried hard enough. The article said he'd been last seen near the logging site after heavy rains caused a landslide. No remains recovered. Elias read it twice, the edges of memory sharpening painfully. He remembered that flood. He and Martha had been stranded for 3 days without power. He had gone into town afterward to check on his crew, and Granger himself had told him one man didn't make it, washed away by the current. A shame. Elias had believed him. He'd wanted to believe him. The paper shook slightly in his hands as another thought crept in, quiet and poisonous. What if Martha had known the truth even then? He turned back to the notebook. There were pages he had missed before, folded together near the back. When he pried them open, something slipped free and fluttered to the floor. He bent down and picked it up. It was a photograph, old and stiff, with age its edges curling. The image showed 2 figures standing near a logging truck. Caleb was one. The other, Martha. She looked younger, her hair tied back, her smile small but familiar. They were close, shoulder to shoulder, the kind of closeness that spoke of trust. Elias stared until his vision blurred. The back of the photograph bore a faint note in pencil: Cedar Hollow, site, October 1978. He set it down gently, feeling the weight of years press upon him. For a long time, he simply breathed the sound loud in the silence. He wanted to be angry, to accuse, but there was no one left to blame. Instead, a hollow ache spread in his chest, the ache of realizing how much he had never asked, how many truths he had ignored because love had made him blind. He could see it as if it were happening again the night before Caleb vanished. Martha had been restless, pacing near the window. He'd been half asleep when she said, "If someone came to you with proof of something terrible, would you do the right thing? Even if it meant losing everything." He'd mumbled something about doing what he could, about how the world didn't change just because one man decided to be brave. She'd looked at him then, disappointment soft but unmistakable, and whispered, "Sometimes one man is all it takes." He had forgotten that moment until now. The memory made his eyes sting. He reached for the photograph again, tracing her face with his thumb. "What did you know?" he asked the empty room. The only reply was the crackle of the stove. Outside, snow began to fall, silent and steady. The forest seemed to draw closer around the cabin as if listening. Elias folded the photograph carefully and slid it between the notebook's pages. His breath misted in the cold air. The truth was starting to take shape like a figure emerging from fog, half-seen, dangerous, inevitable. He knew he couldn't stop now. By the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving Cedar Hollow washed clean under a gray sky. Elias packed the notebook and the photograph into a canvas satchel, the weight of both heavier than it should have been. He buttoned his coat, stepped outside, and locked the cabin door out of habit, though he had nothing left worth stealing. The road to town was a thin ribbon of ice flanked by cedars still whispering in the wind. His truck coughed to life after 3 tries, groaning as if resenting the effort. It had been years since he had gone this far from home. The closer he came to the edge of town, the more uneasy he felt, as though the world he had left behind was waiting to question him. The sheriff's station stood near the square, a squat brick building with a flag that hung limp in the cold. He parked beside a snow-covered cruiser, adjusted his hat, and walked inside. The warmth hit him like a wave. Behind the front desk sat a young man with sandy hair and a badge that gleamed too brightly to have seen much use. The nameplate read, Deputy Hale. He looked up, smiling politely. "Morning, sir. What can I do for you?" Elias placed the satchel on the counter. "I need to speak to someone about a missing person," he said, though he's been missing for more than 40 years. The young deputy's brow lifted slightly. "That's quite a while, isn't it?" "Yes," Elias replied, "and I believe I've found him." 10 minutes later, he sat across from 3 officers in a small interview room. The older of the 3, Sergeant Miller, flipped through the notebook with a frown. "You're saying this man was murdered and buried inside a tree?" he asked, voice flat. Elias nodded. "Not buried. Hidden. Evidence was concealed inside the tree." The officers exchanged looks, the kind people use when they think someone is losing their mind. Miller closed the book gently, pushing it back across the table. "Mr. Warren, we appreciate you bringing this in, but this is a very serious claim. You sure you're feeling all right? It's cold out there. Maybe you Elias's patience thinned." "I'm not making it up. I found his belongings myself. His name was Caleb. The same Caleb Granger Timber reported missing in '78. Miller's expression hardened at the company's name. "That's old history. The records from then are sealed. If you've got concerns, you can leave the items here. We'll take a look when we can." Elias stood abruptly, anger and disbelief warring inside him. "You won't look," he said quietly, "because you already know what you'll find." As he turned to leave, the younger deputy, Hale, stepped forward. "Sir, wait. If you don't mind, I'd like to hear more about what you found." His voice was steady, respectful. Miller sighed and waved him off. "Go ahead, kid." Outside the office, Hale led Elias to a small corner desk cluttered with reports. "They don't mean harm," he said softly, "but around here the past is something people don't like to touch." Elias studied him. The deputy couldn't have been older than 30, yet there was a sincerity in his eyes that reminded him of Daniel. "You ever heard of Caleb?" Elias asked. Hale hesitated. "Caleb Hale. My grandfather. Died before I was born. My dad said he worked the lumber mills." Elias blinked. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Your grandfather's name was Caleb Hale, yes, sir." Why, Elias pulled the notebook from his satchel and opened it to the first page. This was his. Hale's face paled as he read the handwriting tracing the faded letters. "That's impossible," he murmured. "He vanished in a flood. They said no trace was ever found." Elias shook his head. He didn't drown. He was silenced. The words hung between them. Hale flipped through the pages, stopping when a small scrap of paper caught his eye. It had been folded into the binding so tightly it nearly tore when he removed it. Across it, written in uneven block letters, were numbers latitude and longitude. "These are coordinates," Hale said. He pulled his phone from his pocket, entered them, and frowned. "It's the East Creek. That's 10 miles from here." Elias leaned closer. "What's at East Creek?" "Nothing but old forest," Hale replied, "and a few abandoned mills." The 2 men looked at each other, the same unease flickering behind their eyes. Hale closed the notebook carefully. "Whatever's out there, we should see it for ourselves before telling anyone else. If the story's true, we'll need more than words to prove it." Elias nodded, feeling something unfamiliar stir in him, a flicker of purpose, fragile but real. He met the young man's steady gaze and saw for the first time in years a reflection of trust. "Then we go," Elias said quietly. "But we go carefully." Hale nodded, sliding the coordinates into his pocket. The snow outside had started again, thin flakes drifting past the window. The town lights flickered in the distance, and beyond them the dark line of the forest waited. The snow deepened as they drove north, the road narrowing into a thin white trail that wound between the dark shoulders of the forest. The truck's headlights cut through the fog, revealing trees bent under the weight of ice. Deputy Tommy Hale drove his hands tight on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. Elias sat beside him, the notebook resting on his lap, the coordinates memorized now like a prayer. The silence between them was filled with the hum of the engine and the rhythm of chains crunching against frozen ground. The farther they drove, the air grew thinner and sharper, scented with pine and distant water. The sun was a pale disk behind the clouds when they finally reached a clearing where the road ended. Ahead, the East Creek lay still and wide, a ribbon of glass beneath layers of frost. Elias stepped out first, his breath fogging in the air. "This is it," he said. Tommy nodded, checking the map on his phone. "Coordinates match. Whatever we're looking for is close." The two men walked along the creek's edge, boots sinking into powdery snow. The world felt stripped of sound. Even their steps were muffled, absorbed by the white expanse. Elias's thoughts drifted to the past, to the years he had spent avoiding this very place. He remembered bringing Martha here once before everything fell apart. She had said the sound of running water made her feel safe. Now there was no sound at all. They reached a narrow bend where the creek curved sharply between two ridges. The ice there was darker, layered with trapped air bubbles that shimmered like veins. Tommy knelt, brushing snow aside. "Look," he said. Beneath the surface, faint but visible, was a square outline, something buried deep below the ice. Elias crouched beside him, heart pounding. "It's metal," he whispered. "A box, maybe." They worked in silence. Tommy used a pickaxe from the truck to chip away the ice while Elias cleared the snow. Each strike echoed through the hollow valley, ringing against the frozen air. It took nearly an hour before they broke through the last layer of ice, cracking like glass. Beneath it lay a corroded metal container, large enough to hold a man's arm span. They hauled it out together, the effort leaving them breathless. The box was sealed with rusted latches and wrapped in remnants of oilcloth. Elias brushed off the frost, revealing faint letters carved into the lid, property of Granger Timber Company. He looked at Tommy, whose expression had hardened. "This belonged to them," the young man said quietly. "To the company." Elias found a small hammer in the truck's toolbox and pried open the lock. It broke with a dull snap. The lid creaked upward, releasing a breath of stale air, cold and metallic. Inside were film reels, old and brittle, their labels faded. Beneath them lay stacks of papers, maps, invoices, and typed reports marked "Confidential." Tommy pulled one out carefully. "Payroll records," he murmured. "And here incident logs. 2 workers reported missing. No follow-up." Elias lifted one of the film reels, holding it to the light. The edges flaked with rust, but the tape inside was still intact. "We'll need to see what's on these," he said. They loaded the box into the truck and drove to an old ranger's station nearby, long abandoned but still standing. Inside, dust coated everything, and the generator coughed to life only after they changed the old plug and topped the oil. Tommy found an old film projector on a shelf, replaced the brittle belt with a spare from the cabinet, brushed the lens, and let the reels air dry near the stove to drive off moisture. When the film finally began to roll after several test feeds and tension adjustments, the room filled with a soft, clicking sound. At first, there were only images of the mill men working trucks loading logs, the kind of footage used for company archives. Then the angle shifted. The camera was hidden behind a stack of lumber, its focus unsteady but deliberate. A group of men appeared arguing beside the trucks. Elias recognized one of them instantly, Joseph Granger, younger then, but unmistakable. Another man stood apart, gesturing toward a clipboard. Caleb. His face was strained, his mouth forming words the microphone couldn't catch. Suddenly, chaos. 2 men grabbed him. The camera jolted, but the lens caught enough Caleb struggling, shouting, being forced toward the tree line. A woman ran into frame, trying to intervene. Elias froze. The woman was Martha. Her coat, her hair, even the scarf she used to wear, it was all there. She reached into her pocket, pulled out papers, and thrust them at Caleb before someone seized her from behind. The image blurred, shaking violently, before cutting to black. The projector kept spinning, the film flapping at its end. Tommy shut it off slowly. The only sound left was the hum of the generator. Elias stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the empty screen. "She was there," he whispered. "She tried to stop them." Tommy's voice was low. They killed him to keep it quiet. And her. Maybe she knew too much. Elias turned away, pressing a hand against the wall to steady himself. The air felt thin. Outside, the light was fading, and through the cracked window they could see snow beginning to fall again, covering their tracks, one flake at a time. Elias drove the narrow road toward Granger Estates with a heavy chest and a mind full of questions. The snow had stopped, leaving the pine trees glittering with frost under a pale winter sun. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, the notebook and photograph from the creek pressed against his knee. Tommy Hale had insisted he stay with him for backup, but Elias had declined, saying this was a conversation he needed to have, alone. The mansion appeared as a silhouette through the forest, a sprawling structure of stone and timber, modern yet imposing, the kind of home that broadcasted wealth and influence without apology. The driveway was lined with evergreens meticulously trimmed, and the snow shoveled clean, as if the estate itself had been prepared to welcome him or warn him. Elias parked at the circular lot near the front doors, the tires crunching against packed snow. He stepped out, boots sinking slightly, and exhaled slowly, each breath condensed into mist that vanished immediately in the chill air. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would speak, without revealing the shock still coiled in his chest. He rang the bell, and moments later a tall man in a tailored coat appeared. Joseph Granger. The same face from the film, older now, silver streaking his temples, but still the same unmistakable expression of authority. "Mr. Warren," Joseph said smoothly, masking surprise behind a practiced smile. "What brings you here today?" Elias squared his shoulders, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I need the truth, Mr. Granger. About Caleb Hale. About Martha." Joseph's eyes flickered briefly, a shadow crossing his expression, but he kept his composure. "Come in. We can talk inside." It's cold out. Inside were framed certificates and awards for philanthropy. Elias followed him into a study, and Joseph gestured for him to sit in a leather chair opposite a large desk. Elias placed the notebook photograph and the film reels on the desk. "I have proof," he said quietly. Joseph leaned back, steepling his fingers, and regarded the items. "I know why you've come," he said after a pause, voice measured. "And yes, I have things I need to confess." Elias's heart accelerated. "Then speak." Joseph's hands flexed, the tension in his knuckles betraying more than his calm tone. "Caleb Hale. He found something. Something that threatened the company. And your wife Martha, she tried to intervene. I tried to protect both the company and her reputation, as misguided as that sounds." Elias felt his chest tighten. "You killed them," Joseph shook his head slowly. "No, not directly. But I covered up what happened. I moved evidence, silenced witnesses, lied to authorities. I thought it would protect everyone involved. I was wrong." He exhaled, eyes lowering. "I've carried this shadow for decades." Elias produced a small voice recorder from his coat pocket, sliding it across the desk. "Everything you say goes on record. Everything." Joseph studied it, the corners of his mouth twitching as though weighing the risk. Then he nodded once. "Very well. The truth is worse than anyone imagines. Caleb and Martha didn't die by accident. Someone made sure of it. And it wasn't me. The person who ordered their deaths, the one who acted without hesitation, was the sheriff at the time. A man who wore the badge with authority but hid a darkness beneath it. He believed protecting his own position justified the crime. I tried to stop it, but I lacked power then. I lacked courage." Elias's hand shook slightly as he pressed the record button, capturing every word. Joseph continued describing the events in a measured tone, explaining how he had manipulated reports, removed incriminating evidence, and misled investigators. Each detail added weight to the story, confirming the fragments Elias had pieced together over decades. He listened, anger and grief rising in tandem, yet he remained silent, letting the man speak. The more Joseph admitted, the clearer the conspiracy became. The company shielded by law enforcement, lives erased to protect profit and reputation. Elias's fingers curled around the edge of the desk as he imagined Caleb's struggle, Martha's desperation, and the innocence lost to calculated deceit. Joseph leaned forward, the chair creaking, and lowered his voice. I thought I could live with this. I thought charity and community work would balance the scales, but it never did. The truth has a way of surfacing, Mr. Warren, even when buried beneath lies for decades. Elias nodded, slowly, recorder capturing every confession, every admission of guilt and cowardice. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He now held the testimony that could bring justice after 40 years. Outside, a raven called from the pines, its cry sharp in the cold air. Joseph rubbed his temples, sighing the first sign of fatigue he had shown. I'm telling you this because I can't leave it hidden any longer, he said. Elias leaned back, listening, recording understanding that the voice of power he had faced now bore guilt, heavier than any punishment could deliver. Every lie and manipulation was now documented. The estate was silent, except for the soft tick of a clock and the hum of the recorder. The winter light fell through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wood and the grim set of Joseph Granger's face. Elias pressed his thumb against the record button to ensure it captured the final statement, the man's own acknowledgement of the sheriff's crimes and the long decades of deceit. Elias drove back from Granger Estates with a tight grip on the recorder, the weight of decades pressing against his chest. Tommy Hale rode beside him in silence, the coordinates for East Creek scribbled on a scrap of paper, the notebook stowed safely under the seat. Both men understood that the moment they revealed the truth, the world around them could shift violently. Elias had planned to hand over the recording and the documents directly to the FBI, hoping the federal authority would act swiftly and protect them. The snow had softened the roads, but the morning sun was weak, barely cutting through the gray skies. As they neared Cedar Hollow, a flicker of unease pricked at Elias's senses, the same instinct that had served him for decades. Pulling into his driveway, Elias stopped short. Smoke. Dark plumes curling into the sky. His cabin. Flames licked the roofline, consuming everything he had built in solitude over 20 years. Heart hammering, Elias leapt from the truck, running toward the inferno. The door hung ajar, warped and blackened. Every piece of furniture, the collection of books, the hand-carved walking stick, the photographs of Martha, all gone. Elias felt hollow, a void opening in his chest. Tommy caught up, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. We need to go, he said quietly, the ash from the fire drifting onto their coats. Elias nodded, swallowing bile, tears threatening, but held at bay. They turned, leaving the ruin behind, walking quickly to the truck. The phone lines in town were dead cut or disabled, and the mountainside cell coverage was non-existent that week. Whoever had set the fire knew they were coming. There was no turning back. A few hours later, they were deep in the woods, far from the nearest road, seeking refuge in an old hunting cabin Elias had once discovered as a boy. The walls were rotted, the roof sagging, but it would keep them out of sight. Inside, they set down the satchel containing the notebook and the recorder. Elias checked the equipment obsessively, ensuring nothing had been damaged. Outside, the forest seemed vast and indifferent, the wind whispering through the pines as if warning them that danger lingered. Tommy Elias said, voice low, "They know we have it. They will come for us." Tommy nodded, running a hand through his hair, worry etched in every line of his face. "And the department?" Elias's expression hardened. "Gone. You know what that means." Tommy swallowed understanding. Earlier that day, an internal memo reached him. He had been suspended officially for leaking confidential information. The agency denied him access to any cases. Now in the remote cabin, stripped of support, they were completely exposed. Elias moved to the small wood stove, stirring a few embers he had found. He crouched beside it, shivering despite the fire. His body ached, illness that had simmered beneath the surface for weeks. Now flared his chest, burning with fatigue. Yet the determination in his eyes was sharper than ever. "We finish this," he said almost to himself. "We finish it with truth. No blood, only justice." Tommy watched, hesitant but resolute. Do you really think we can? Elias's eyes met his fierce and unwavering. We have what they can't take from us. We have proof, undeniable proof. They can burn my cabin, suspend you, threaten us, doesn't matter. The law is on our side if we stay smart. Night fell quickly, dark and heavy, pressing against the thin walls of the cabin. Elias lay on a cot, shivering, fever rising, but he refused to sleep more than necessary. Tommy sat at the table going over the maps, coordinating their plan of action, ensuring they left no trace. The sound of distant wildlife was constant, yet every snap of a twig made their hearts skip a beat. Elias's hand went to the recorder, repeatedly feeling the weight of decades of injustice resting in that small device. Each breath was a calculation of survival and morality. The woods offered safety, but also the isolation that could kill a man's resolve. He thought of Caleb, of Martha, of every person who had suffered because of Granger and his allies. Anger surged, tempered by the years of wisdom and caution. He would see it through, not with vengeance, but with accountability. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional rustle in the trees or the creak of the cabin. Elias coughed, chest burning, but he sat up straight, gripping the recorder. They tried to scare us, he whispered, voice raw, but it's not enough. It will never be enough. Outside, the wind howled through the frozen pines, a warning and a companion. Inside, Elias and Tommy prepared for what would come, knowing that the path ahead was fraught with peril, yet understanding that justice demanded patience, courage, and endurance. The snow had melted into slush by the time Elias and Tommy emerged from the forest, the air damp and sharp, with the promise of spring thaw. Elias moved slowly, his body still weakened by illness, but his mind was alert, every sense tuned to the quiet that surrounded them. Tommy carried the recorder and the reels of film in a waterproof case, each step carefully measured. We can't just hand these to the FBI directly, Tommy said quietly, as they approached a secluded road, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. Not after everything that happened. Someone might intercept them. Elias nodded, understanding the weight of secrecy and strategy. Then we find someone who can't be intimidated, he said, voice low, carrying a quiet intensity. Hours later, they arrived at a small office tucked into a side street of a distant town. The windows were streaked with rain and dust, and the door swung open to reveal Marissa Clark, a seasoned investigative journalist with eyes that had seen the fallout of corporate corruption before. Her hands shook slightly as Tommy handed over the case, explaining in hushed tones the decades of injustice, the cover-ups and the murders that had been silenced. Marissa listened intently, nodding occasionally, her sharp eyes scanning each document and frame of film, weighing the veracity, the impact the story hidden in plain sight for over 40 years. You've brought me fire and ice, she said finally. If we get this right, it will change everything. For the next several days, she worked tirelessly, verifying records, cross-referencing documents, enhancing the footage from the reels to reveal faces and names long buried, and with counsel creating time-stamped duplicates and documenting a chain of custody for every item. Elias stayed nearby, frail but vigilant, while Tommy coordinated their security, ensuring that no one outside their trusted circle discovered their movements. On the night the expose aired, Elias sat in a rented cabin with a single lamp, casting warm light across the room. He held a steaming cup of coffee, trembling slightly from both anticipation and weakness. Tommy sat opposite him, eyes fixed on the flickering television screen. The news anchor introduced the story carefully, then rolled the segment footage of Granger Timber Company executives' previously unseen documents, the old film showing Caleb Hale and Martha struggling, and the detailed audio of Joseph Granger's confession. The story unfolded with precision, revealing the depth of the crimes, the decades-long cover-ups, and the network of law enforcement corruption spanning 3 counties. Elias felt a tight knot loosen in his chest as viewers across the state gasped in disbelief. Phones rang, and reports flooded into authorities. Within days, the FBI confirmed they were mobilizing teams to investigate the claims, obtained emergency warrants based on the authenticated materials, and executed searches and interviews that included the retired county sheriff named in the testimony. Agents arrived quietly, but efficiently, combing through old files, interviewing witnesses, and connecting the threads that Elias and Tommy had painstakingly gathered. Soon after, agents located Joseph Granger at a private airstrip as he prepared to leave the state and took him into custody. Agents arrested him just as he stepped toward a small private plane, his face a mixture of disbelief and rage. The charges were extensive conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice evidence, tampering, and public corruption spanning decades. Elias watched from a safe distance, chest swelling with relief and awe at the culmination of years of meticulous work. News outlets across the country covered the story. The evidence was undeniable, the connections irrefutable. Meanwhile, Tommy received word from the state police department his suspension was lifted, and he was reinstated with honors recognized for courage and integrity in the face of systemic threats. Elias, though still weakened, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in decades, the shadows of Caleb and Martha's deaths were confronted openly, justice pursued through truth rather than vengeance. The recognition brought by the investigation cleared his name as well, and the FBI formally acknowledged his contribution to unveiling the decades-long conspiracy. In the quiet moments that followed, Elias reflected on the journey from the discovery of the tree to the frozen creek, to the confessions and the broadcasts that shook the state. Every risk, every sleepless night, every step into uncertainty had led to this moment. The snow outside had receded, revealing the forest floor damp, but alive, hinting at new beginnings. Elias felt a tremor of hope he hadn't allowed himself in years. Justice had been served not by force of arms, but through persistence, courage, and the enduring power of truth. For Tommy Elias and all those connected to the story, the revelation offered closure, a sense of vindication, and a chance to finally breathe after decades of hidden grief and unspoken horrors. Spring had returned to Cedar Hollow, the snow melting into the rich, dark soil of the forest floor. Birds flitted among budding branches, and the air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a promise of renewal. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, surveying the work that had begun after the state cleared the area for the memorial project. Heavy machinery had removed fallen debris and trimmed overgrowth, yet in the center stood a single tree, untouched, a tall, ancient cedar that had once concealed a tragic secret. Its bark was scarred from decades of life, and Elias traced the ridges with his fingertips, feeling the rhythm of its growth, the story of the life it had silently carried. He whispered a quiet acknowledgement to Caleb and Martha, recognizing the weight of the past and the way truth had finally emerged. He had requested that the tree remain a living sentinel, a witness to history, and a symbol of endurance. Around him, volunteers and local artisans worked diligently constructing paths and placing plaques that told the story of those who had suffered and those who had fought to reveal justice. Children wandered nearby, with sketchbooks drawing the contours of the land, while elderly visitors traced the stones with gentle hands, leaving small tokens of remembrance. Elias had converted the old hunting cabin into the Cedar Hollow Memorial. Its walls cleaned its roof, reinforced now a center where survivors, veterans, and families could come to record their stories. Inside, tables lined with journals, pens, and recording devices awaited, providing tools for people to reclaim narratives lost to time and tragedy. Each object had a purpose, every detail chosen to allow the process of storytelling to become a healing ritual. Elias walked through the cabin, checking that everything was in place, his hands lightly brushing over the surfaces, the walls echoing faintly with voices and memories of the past. He paused by a photograph of Caleb and Martha placed carefully on a shelf, the faces frozen in joy and anticipation before the calamity. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but he held them back, feeling gratitude that justice delayed, though it had been served. Outside, the cedar swayed gently in the wind needles, catching sunlight like gold dust. Elias positioned a small bench beneath it, envisioning countless hours where people could sit, reflect, and write letters to lost loved ones, or record memories that had long been silenced. Over the weeks, he watched as families arrived, some guided by grief, others by curiosity, and witnessed the raw emotions unfold. Some cried quietly, tracing the bark of the memorial tree. Others read aloud letters they had written to parents, children, or spouses who had vanished in the forests over decades. Elias assisted where he could, offering a patient ear, an encouraging word, and sometimes simply the warmth of his presence. Each story shared seemed to lighten the burdens carried by those who had suffered in isolation, their voices now merging with the forest's own quiet cadence. Tommy visited regularly, bringing updates from the veterans and families, coordinating events, and ensuring the memorial reached those who needed it most. One afternoon, he found Elias seated on the cabin's porch, sunlight illuminating the lines of his face, softening the weariness that had been etched there over 20 years. In his hands was a letter, worn at the edges, penned by his son many years ago, the handwriting careful and familiar. Elias read aloud softly, a faint smile breaking across his lips, the first genuine smile he had allowed himself in decades. The corners of his eyes crinkled, and the weight of years of isolation, grief, and pursuit of truth seemed to ease in that moment. "It's not that I found the truth," he said quietly to Tommy, who stood nearby watching. "It's that the truth found me, and in doing so, it saved me." Tommy nodded, understanding more deeply than words could convey, feeling the relief and quiet triumph of the moment. The camera of memory lingered, capturing the sunlight filtering through the trees, the small smiles of visitors, the steady presence of the cedar that had borne witness to tragedy and survival. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying the faint echoes of laughter, the low murmur of conversations, and the sigh of relief from those who had found a voice again. Elias remained on the porch long after the letters were read, letting the forest wrap around him every detail. The smell of pine, the distant rush of water, the warmth of sunlight imprinting on his soul. The memorial became more than a tribute. It was a place of quiet redemption, of reconciliation, of human connection, forged through the enduring power of honesty and remembrance. In the evenings, Elias often sat alone writing letters to those who could never receive them, reading their stories aloud to the wind, imagining their voices joining the chorus of the forest. The cedar stood sentinel branches, swaying in silent applause, holding the memory of Caleb and Martha, Elias's own journey, and the lives restored by the courage to pursue truth. Each visitor left a mark, a stone, placed a line, written, a memory shared, until the cabin, the clearing, and the tree together formed a sanctuary for all who sought solace. In the golden light of late afternoon, the camera pulled back over the forest sunlight, dancing across the clearing. Elias remained on the porch, reading another letter. His smile quiet, the weight of the past finally eased by truth and resilience. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to hit like and subscribe to follow along for more. We'd love to hear from you. What part of the story surprised you the most? And where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below.